Susan Morris woke up that morning like any other day. The sun came through her bedroom window as her alarm went off at 6:30 a.m. She got out of bed, put on her robe, and went to wake up her daughter, Emma. Emma, time to get up for school. Susan called as she knocked on her daughter's door. No answer came. Susan smiled and shook her head. Emma was 12 years old and entering that stage where mornings were difficult. Susan opened the door, expecting to see her daughter buried under blankets. Emma? The bed was empty. In fact, it was still made from yesterday. Susan felt a small pain in her chest as she checked the bathroom. Empty. She checked the living room, the kitchen, even the backyard. Emma was nowhere in the house. Susan tried to stay calm. Maybe Emma had gone to her friend Lily's house last night? But Emma would never leave without telling her mother. Susan called Lily's mom, who hadn't seen Emma. She called 5 more of Emma's friends. No one had seen her daughter since school yesterday. The pain in Susan's chest grew stronger. She called the school. Emma had attended all her classes the day before and left at the normal time. Susan's hands shook as she dialed 911. "My daughter is missing," she told the operator, her voice breaking. "She's 12 years old. She never came home from school yesterday." The police arrived within minutes. They asked Susan many questions about Emma. When did she last see her? What was she wearing? Did she have any problems at home or school? Did she have a boyfriend? Was she upset about anything? Susan answered everything as best she could. Emma had been wearing jeans, a green sweater, and her favorite white sneakers. She carried a blue backpack with a butterfly keychain. Her long brown hair was usually in a ponytail. No, there were no problems at home. Emma was a happy child who loved art and science. She got good grades and had many friends. She would never run away, Susan told the officers. Never. By afternoon, the small town of Pine Creek was full of activity. Neighbors formed search parties. Emma's picture was posted everywhere. Police officers walked through the woods behind the school. They checked empty buildings and spoke with everyone along the route Emma normally walked home. Susan sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by friends who tried to comfort her. Her body felt cold despite the warm coffee in her hands. The police had taken Emma's hairbrush for DNA and were checking her computer and phone records. That night, as darkness fell, Susan stood at her front window. Outside, flashlights moved through the neighborhood as people continued searching. A news van was parked across the street. Emma's disappearance was now the top story on local news. Susan's sister Jennifer arrived from the next town over and hugged her tightly. "They'll find her," Jennifer whispered. "They have to." But as hours turned into days and days into a week, Emma remained missing. The police found no clues, no witnesses who saw anything unusual. It was as if Emma had simply vanished into thin air on her walk home from school. Susan stopped going to work. She couldn't sleep. She barely ate. All she did was look at Emma's pictures and wait by the phone. She joined the searches, walking through the same areas again and again, calling Emma's name until her voice was gone. 1 month after Emma disappeared, Detective Mark Wilson sat with Susan at her kitchen table. "We're not giving up," he promised her. "But I need to be honest with you. Without new information, we don't know where else to look." Susan nodded, her face thin and pale from weeks of worry. "I'll find her," she whispered. "If it takes the rest of my life, I'll find my daughter." She didn't know then that her search would last 15 long years. 5 years passed since Emma disappeared. Susan Morris was no longer the same woman. Her once dark hair now showed streaks of gray. The lines around her eyes had deepened. She had moved from their old house to a small apartment, unable to bear the empty bedroom that waited for a child who never came home. Every morning, Susan woke up and checked her phone. Every night, she fell asleep with Emma's photo next to her bed. The police case remained open but had gone cold. Detective Wilson still called once a month, but he never had anything new to share. "I know my daughter is out there somewhere," Susan told anyone who would listen. "I can feel it in my heart." Susan had turned her pain into purpose. She started a group for parents of missing children in their state. She organized yearly walks to keep Emma's case in the public eye. She learned how to use social media to share Emma's story and age-progressed photos showing what her daughter might look like as she grew older. On Emma's 17th birthday, Susan baked a chocolate cake, Emma's favorite. She sat alone at her kitchen table, a single candle burning. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," she whispered, tears falling onto the tablecloth. "Wherever you are, I hope you're okay." Susan had heard all the statistics about missing children. She knew that with each passing year, the chances of finding Emma alive grew smaller. Friends and family had gently suggested she find a way to move on. Even her sister Jennifer had stopped mentioning Emma's name, afraid of the pain it caused. But Susan couldn't let go. She kept a box of newspaper clippings about Emma's case. She maintained a website with updates and information. Every Christmas, she hung Emma's stocking. Every school year, she imagined what grade Emma would be entering. By the 10th year, Susan had learned to live with a heart that was always partially broken. She had returned to work as a nurse at the local hospital. She volunteered on weekends. She even went on a few dates, though they never led anywhere. How could she explain to a new person the empty space that filled so much of her life? "You're still young?" Her friend Maria told her over coffee one day. "Emma would want you to be happy." Susan nodded, but she couldn't imagine true happiness without knowing what had happened to her daughter. The not knowing was the hardest part. Was Emma alive? Was she safe? Did she remember her mother? In the 12th year, there was a possible sighting in a town 3 states away. Susan drove through the night to get there, her heart pounding with hope. But it wasn't Emma. The disappointment nearly broke her. "I'm sorry for wasting your time," she told Detective Wilson, who had also made the trip. "No lead is a waste of time," he said kindly. "We'll keep looking." By the 15th year, Emma's case was featured on a popular true crime show. The episode brought in hundreds of tips, but none led anywhere. Susan watched the show alone in her apartment, seeing her younger self on screen, desperate and wild-eyed in those first days. The world had changed so much since Emma disappeared. Cell phones were smarter. Cars could almost drive themselves. If Emma had disappeared today, there would have been cameras everywhere, tracking her movements. But in 2010, the technology wasn't as advanced. The few security cameras near the school hadn't captured anything useful. Susan had just turned 52 when her phone rang late one night. She was already in bed, reading a book. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello," she answered, sitting up. "Mrs. Morris?" a woman's voice asked. "This is Officer Patel from the Chicago Police Department. I'm calling about your daughter, Emma." Susan's hand tightened around the phone. After 15 years of false hopes and dead ends, she had learned to expect nothing. But something in the officer's voice made her heart race. "Yes," Susan whispered, barely breathing. "What about Emma?" Susan's hands trembled as she held the phone against her ear. Officer Patel's words came through the line, each one making Susan's heart beat faster. "We have a young woman here at our station," Officer Patel said. "She came in yesterday with some questions about a missing persons case from Pine Creek. She has information about Emma Morris." Susan sank onto the edge of her bed. For 15 years, she had imagined this moment. Now that it was here, she could hardly speak. Is she there? Is it Emma?" Susan finally managed to ask. "The woman won't give us her name," Officer Patel explained carefully. "She's about 27 years old, which matches how old your daughter would be now. She has a small birthmark behind her right ear, shaped like a half moon." Susan gasped. Emma's birthmark. She had never mentioned it to the media, wanting to keep some details private. Something only the real Emma would have. "That's my daughter's birthmark," Susan whispered. "No one would know about that unless—" "Mrs. Morris, we need you to come to Chicago as soon as possible," Officer Patel said. "Detective Wilson from your local department has been informed. He suggested I call you directly." "I'll leave right now," Susan said, already getting up to pack a bag. "I can be there by morning." Susan called her sister Jennifer, who insisted on driving her to Chicago. The 4-hour drive was the longest of Susan's life. She stared out the window as the highway lights flashed by, her mind racing with questions. "What if it's not her?" Jennifer asked gently as they crossed the state line. "I don't want you to be hurt again, Susan." "And what if it is?" Susan replied. "I have to know." They arrived at the Chicago police station at 6:30 a.m. Detective Wilson was already there, having driven up during the night. He had been with the case since the beginning, and even after his retirement 2 years ago, he had stayed involved. "Susan," he said, giving her a quick hug. "They've been waiting for you." Officer Pavel met them in the lobby and led them to a small meeting room. "The young woman is very nervous," she explained. She's been through a lot. We've called in a counselor to be present during your meeting. Susan nodded, her mouth dry. Does she know I'm here? Yes, she's ready to meet you, but she's asked to speak to you alone first, before we involve any more officials. Susan followed Officer Paddle down a hallway to another room. The officer opened the door and stepped aside. Sitting at a table was a young woman with long brown hair. She wore a simple blue sweater and jeans. Her hands were clasped tightly together on the table. When she looked up, Susan saw familiar eyes that had haunted her dreams for 15 years. The young woman stood slowly. "Mrs. Morris?" she said, her voice soft and uncertain. Susan couldn't move. The girl before her was a stranger, yet somehow so familiar. She had Emma's eyes, Emma's nose. She was tall, like Emma's father had been. "Emma," Susan whispered, afraid to believe. The young woman shook her head slightly. "They call me Olivia," she said. "Olivia Pearson. But her voice broke. "I've been having these dreams. Dreams about another house, another family. And then I found this." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small blue butterfly keychain, worn and faded. Susan's legs nearly gave out. Emma's keychain from her backpack, the one she had been carrying the day she disappeared. "Where did you get that?" Susan asked, her voice shaking. Olivia, or Emma, looked down at the keychain in her hand. "It was in a box in my parents' attic. My parents, who I'm starting to think, aren't my real parents at all." Susan took a step forward, then another. 15 years of searching, of hoping, of praying had led to this moment. "May I?" she asked, reaching out slowly. The young woman nodded, and Susan gently turned her head to look behind her right ear. There it was, the small half-moon birthmark, exactly where it had always been. Susan covered her mouth with her hand as tears filled her eyes. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's really you." The small meeting room in the Chicago police station fell silent. Susan couldn't take her eyes off the young woman sitting across from her. After 15 years of emptiness, her daughter was here, alive, grown up, and calling herself Olivia Pearson. "I don't understand," Olivia said, her voice shaking. "If you're my real mother, then who are Robert and Linda Pearson?" Susan took a deep breath. "I don't know who they are, but they took you from me when you were 12 years old. You disappeared walking home from school on October 18th, 2010. Olivia's face went pale. "That can't be right. My parents told me we moved to Illinois from California when I was 13. They have photos of me as a baby, school records." Detective Wilson knocked gently and entered the room. "Miss Pearson, we believe your school records may have been falsified. Did you ever see your birth certificate?" Olivia nodded slowly. "Once, when I applied for college, it said I was born in Sacramento." "We'll need to check that document," Detective Wilson said. "Mrs. Morris registered Emma's disappearance nationally. We have Emma's DNA on file, and with your permission, we can compare it to yours." "I'll do the test," Olivia said firmly. "I need to know the truth." While they waited for the DNA results, Olivia told Susan about her life with the Pearsons. They had moved often during her teenage years, never staying in one place for long. She wasn't allowed to have social media accounts. When she asked about relatives, they said everyone had died in a car accident. "They were strict but not cruel," Olivia explained. "They paid for my college. They came to my graduation. How could they do something so terrible?" Susan listened, her heart breaking for all they had lost. "What made you start questioning things?" she asked. Olivia touched the butterfly keychain. "I found a box in the attic last month when I was helping them pack to move again. This keychain was inside, along with the journal I don't remember writing. The handwriting was mine, but the name in it was Emma. There were entries about a school in Pine Creek and friends I'd never heard of." She paused, eyes filling with tears. "The last entry was from October 17th, 2010. It said you were taking me shopping for a Halloween costume that weekend." Susan remembered that promise. They had planned to look for materials to make Emma's scientist costume. "When I asked my parents about the journal, they got angry. Said it must have belonged to the previous homeowners. But I knew it was my handwriting, even if it was younger." Olivia wiped her eyes. "I started doing research online. I found missing children websites and saw a photo of Emma Morris from Pine Creek. She looked like my childhood photos." Officer Paddle entered with a folder. The preliminary DNA results are in, she said quietly. It's a match. You are Emma Morris. The confirmation hit both women hard. Susan reached across the table, her hand open. After a moment, Olivia placed her hand in her mother's. Where are the Pearsons now? Detective Wilson asked. They were planning to move to Canada next week, Olivia said, her voice stronger now. They don't know I'm here. Detective Wilson stood up. We'll need to bring them in for questioning. Officer Patel, please arrange for a team to locate Robert and Linda Pearson. As the officers left the room, Susan and Olivia, now confirmed to be Emma, sat in silence, still holding hands. I don't know what to call you, Emma finally said. I've been Olivia for so long. You can call me Susan if that's easier, Susan offered, though the thought pained her. We have time to figure things out. Emma nodded, studying her mother's face. You never stopped looking for me, did you? Not for a single day, Susan replied, squeezing her daughter's hand. Not for a single minute. Outside the room, the police were already planning the arrest of the couple who had stolen 15 years from both their lives. But inside, mother and daughter began the delicate process of finding each other again. 3 days later, Susan sat in a different room at the police station. This time, she watched through a one-way glass as officers brought in Robert and Linda Pearson. The couple had been arrested at their home while packing the last of their belongings for their planned move to Canada. Robert Pearson was tall with gray hair and glasses. Linda was shorter with dyed blonde hair. They looked like ordinary people, the kind you might see at a grocery store or post office. It was hard for Susan to believe these were the people who had stolen her daughter. They don't look like monsters, Susan whispered to Detective Wilson, who stood beside her. They rarely do, he replied quietly. Emma had chosen not to watch the interrogation. She was staying at Susan's hotel, trying to process everything that had happened. The DNA test had confirmed what they already knew in their hearts. Olivia Pearson was indeed Emma Morris. Inside the interrogation room, Linda Pearson broke down almost immediately. We never meant to keep her forever, she sobbed as the detective questioned her. It was just supposed to be for a little while. The story came out piece by piece. 15 years ago, the Pearsons had lost their only daughter to cancer. In their grief, they had driven to neighboring states, with no clear purpose. When they saw Emma walking home alone, something in Linda snapped. She looked so much like our Caroline, Linda explained through tears. Robert was getting gas, and I called her over to the car. I told her I was a friend of her mother's and that there was an emergency. Susan felt sick listening to how easily her daughter had been taken. She had taught Emma about stranger danger, but the Pearsons hadn't approached as strangers. We were going to bring her back, Robert insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. But days turned into weeks, and we had already told her that her mother had died. We changed her name, moved to Illinois, created a new life. Did you ever think about what you were doing to her real mother? The interrogator asked. Robert looked down at his hands. We tried not to. Susan turned away from the window, unable to watch any more. The selfishness of these people was beyond her understanding. They had taken her child because they couldn't bear their own loss, never considering the loss they were causing. Later that evening, Susan returned to the hotel room she now shared with Emma. Her daughter sat cross-legged on one of the beds, looking through the file of newspaper clippings Susan had brought with her. You kept everything, Emma said, looking up as Susan entered. Of course I did. Susan sat down carefully on the other bed. I never gave up hope. Emma picked up a flyer from the file. It showed her 12-year-old face smiling back at the camera. It's strange. I remember taking this photo. It was for school picture day, but everything after that is different from what I thought. Susan waited patiently as Emma put the papers back in the file. The Pearsons told me my mother died when I was young, Emma said quietly. They showed me a grave in California once, said it was yours. Susan felt her heart break all over again. I'm so sorry, Emma. They let me put flowers on it. Emma continued, her voice steady but sad. Every year on Mother's Day, I've been mourning a mother who was alive and searching for me. Susan moved to sit beside her daughter and gently took her hand. What happens now is up to you. I know you can't just go back to being the 12-year-old girl who left for school one day. You're your own person now. Emma looked at their joined hands. I don't know what to feel. Part of me is angry at them for lying, but another part still loves them. Susan finished for her. They raised you for 15 years. It's okay to have complicated feelings about this. Emma nodded, grateful for the understanding. The police say they'll go to prison. Probably, Susan said. What they did was wrong. Very wrong. They sat in silence for a moment, both women thinking about the long journey ahead. 1 week after the discovery, Emma stood outside Susan's apartment building with a small suitcase. The court had released her to Susan's custody while the legal case against the Pearsons continued. Robert and Linda remained in jail, unable to post the high bail set by the judge. Emma took a deep breath before pressing the buzzer. She had spent the last 15 years living as Olivia Pearson. Now she was expected to become Emma Morris again. The weight of two identities pressed on her shoulders as she waited. The door opened, and Susan appeared, her face lighting up at the sight of her daughter. "You're here," Susan said, stepping back to let Emma enter. "I cleaned out the spare room for you. I hope it's okay." Emma nodded and followed Susan up the stairs to the second-floor apartment. The space was small but warm, with photos covering most surfaces. Emma stopped when she saw a wall dedicated entirely to her childhood pictures, alongside age progression photos created by police artists over the years. "The last one is pretty close," Emma said, pointing to the most recent age progression. "They got my nose wrong, though." Susan smiled sadly. "I used to stare at these for hours, trying to imagine what you really looked like now." The spare room was simple but comfortable. Susan had bought new bedding and cleared space in the closet. On the nightstand sat a small teddy bear. "Is that?" Emma picked up the stuffed animal. "Mr. Buttons," Susan confirmed. "He was your favorite. You slept with him every night until you were about 10. Emma turned the bear over in her hands. A memory flashed, cuddling the bear while Susan read her a bedtime story. It was like watching a movie of someone else's life, yet she knew it was hers. "I remember him," she whispered. That night, Emma called her boyfriend, Mark, who was still in Chicago. They had been dating for 2 years, and he was struggling to understand the situation. "How are things there?" he asked over the phone. "Strange," Emma admitted, sitting on her new bed. "Susan is nice. My mother, I mean. But it's like I've walked into someone else's life." "Are you coming back to Chicago?" Mark asked, his voice hopeful. "I don't know yet," Emma said honestly. "The police still need me here for the case, and I need to figure out who I am now." After the call, Emma walked to the living room where Susan was watching TV. She sat on the opposite end of the couch, still maintaining a careful distance. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said. Susan immediately turned off the television. "Anything." "What was I like before I disappeared?" Susan's face softened with memories. "You were creative, always drawing or making things. You loved science and wanted to be a marine biologist. You were stubborn too. Once you set your mind on something, nothing could change it." Emma smiled slightly. "That part hasn't changed. I studied biology in college." "Really?" Susan leaned forward, eager for this connection. "Yes, I'm working in a research lab in Chicago now. Marine mammals." Susan's eyes filled with tears. "You found your way to it, even without remembering." The next morning, Detective Wilson came to the apartment with news. The Pearsons had confessed to the kidnapping in exchange for a reduced sentence. They would still serve many years in prison. "They've also provided information about how they created Olivia's identity," he explained. "They used a birth certificate from a baby who died shortly after birth in California." Emma sat very still, absorbing this information. Her entire identity had been built on a lie. Even her name had belonged to someone else first. "There's one more thing," Detective Wilson said gently. "We found a diary in their house. It appears to be yours, from before the kidnapping. Would you like to have it?" Emma nodded, unable to speak. When the detective handed her the small book with a rainbow cover, her hands trembled. Inside was her childish handwriting, telling stories of a life she could barely remember living. Susan reached across the coffee table, her hand open but not demanding. After a moment, Emma took it. 2 lives were colliding, and somehow, they would need to find a way forward together. 2 months passed since Emma had come to live with Susan. Spring arrived, bringing new flowers to the small garden outside Susan's apartment. Inside, mother and daughter were slowly growing accustomed to each other's presence. Emma sat at the kitchen table, reading through her old diary for the 10th time. Each page revealed pieces of her forgotten childhood, birthday parties, school friends, family trips to the lake. Some entries made her laugh, others brought tears. It was like reading about a stranger who was somehow also herself. "Find anything interesting?" Susan asked, setting a cup of coffee in front of Emma. "I apparently hated broccoli with a passion," Emma said, smiling slightly. "There's a whole page just complaining about it." Susan laughed. "You would hide it in your napkin when you thought I wasn't looking." These small connections happen more often now, a memory shared, a habit recognized. Yet there remained a distance between them that neither knew how to cross. The trial of Robert and Linda Pearson was scheduled to begin next month. Emma would have to testify against the people who had raised her for 15 years. The thought filled her with dread. "I got a letter from Linda today," Emma said quietly, pulling an envelope from her pocket. Susan's face tightened, but she nodded. "What did she say?" "She apologized. Said they never meant to cause so much pain." Emma folded the letter carefully. "She wants me to visit her in jail." "Are you going to?" Susan kept her voice neutral, though Emma could see the worry in her eyes. "I don't know yet." Emma took a sip of coffee. "Part of me wants answers. Another part never wants to see her again." The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Susan went to answer it, returning a moment later with Mark, Emma's boyfriend from Chicago. "Mark." Emma stood quickly, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Mark looked nervous, glancing between Emma and Susan. "I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to see you." Susan quietly excused herself, giving them privacy. Emma led Mark to the small living room, both sitting awkwardly on the couch. "You look different," he said, studying her face. "I'm still me," Emma replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. Mark took her hand. "I miss you. The lab isn't the same without you. When are you coming home?" The question hung in the air. Chicago had been home for years, but now Pine Creek was pulling at her too, not just because of Susan, but because of the past she was slowly reclaiming. "I don't know," Emma admitted. "Everything's complicated right now." Later that evening, after Mark had checked into a nearby hotel, Emma found Susan sitting on the small balcony, looking at the stars. "He seems nice," Susan said as Emma joined her. "He is." Emma wrapped a blanket around her shoulders against the cool night air. "We met at work. He studies dolphin communication." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the night sky. "I got a call from the lab director today," Emma said finally. "They want me back next month. They can't hold my position much longer." Susan nodded, still looking at the stars. "You should go back. Your life is there." "But what about the trial?" "What about?" Emma gestured vaguely between them. "All of this." Susan turned to face her daughter. "Emma, I spent 15 years imagining what your life might be like. I pictured you growing up, graduating, finding your path. In all those dreams, you were happy and successful." She reached out to touch Emma's hand. "Now I know you are. The Pearsons did terrible things, but you still grew into an amazing woman." Emma felt tears forming in her eyes. "I don't want to lose you again." "You won't," Susan promised. "We found each other now. Whether you live here or in Chicago or on the moon, that won't change." The next morning, Emma called the lab director and arranged to return to work. She also called the prison and scheduled a visit with Linda Pearson. Both conversations were difficult, but necessary. When she finished, she found Susan in the kitchen making breakfast. "I've made some decisions," Emma said, sitting at the table. Susan turned from the stove, spatula in hand. "I'm listening." As they talked about the future, something shifted between them. The bridge they were building felt stronger now, not complete, but sturdy enough to cross. 1 year had passed since Emma discovered her true identity. The seasons had changed, bringing fall leaves once again to Pine Creek. The trial of Robert and Linda Pearson had ended 6 months ago, with both receiving 10-year sentences. Emma had testified, looking them in the eyes as she described the confusion and pain of learning the truth. Today, Emma stood outside her childhood home. Susan had finally decided to sell the house where they had lived before the kidnapping. It had been rented out for years, but Susan could never bring herself to let it go completely. Now, it was time. Ready? Susan asked, unlocking the front door. Emma nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The house looked different. New paint, different furniture from the tenants, but the layout was the same. Emma walked slowly through the living room, touching the wall where height marks had once tracked her growth. This way, Susan said softly, leading Emma upstairs to what had been her bedroom. The room was empty now, waiting for new owners. Sunlight streamed through the window, creating patterns on the wooden floor. Emma stood in the center, turning slowly. I remember the purple walls, she said, looking at the now beige paint. And stars on the ceiling. Susan smiled. Glow-in-the-dark constellations. You insisted on putting them up exactly like the real night sky. For the past year, Emma had been living in Chicago, working at her lab while maintaining regular calls and visits with Susan. Mark had proposed 3 months ago, and Emma wore his ring on her finger. They were planning a small wedding for next spring. Do you think we could have been happy if I had never disappeared? Emma asked, looking out the bedroom window at the street where she once played. We were happy, Susan replied. And we're finding our way back to happiness now, just differently. After the house tour, they drove to the small cafe in town. Several people recognized Susan, and a few older residents looked curiously at Emma. The story had been in all the local papers when Emma was found, but this was her first time back in Pine Creek since she was 12. Mrs. Wilson, a gray-haired woman, approached their table. Is this? Yes, Marge. This is my daughter, Emma. Susan's voice held pride and wonder still. The woman's eyes filled with tears. I remember when you went missing, dear. Your mother never gave up. More people came to their table. Former neighbors, Susan's old co-workers, a teacher Emma barely remembered. Each had been part of the search years ago. Each had carried a piece of hope for Susan when hers faltered. Later, they visited the small memorial garden the town had planted when Emma disappeared. It had grown into a beautiful space with benches and flowers. A new plaque had been added. In celebration of Emma Morris's return, never lose hope. As evening approached, Emma and Susan walked through the town park. Emma's phone buzzed with a message from Mark. Checking in on her day, she smiled as she replied. How does it feel? Susan asked. Being back here? Emma considered the question carefully. Like I'm connecting dots between who I was then and who I am now. They sat on a bench overlooking the small lake where Emma had once learned to swim. The sunset painted the water orange and gold. I'm going to ask Mark if we can look for a house with a guest room, Emma said, so you can visit whenever you want. Stay as long as you like. Susan squeezed her daughter's hand. I'd like that. They had found a new relationship, not exactly mother and daughter in the traditional sense, but something unique and valuable. The Pearsons had stolen 15 years, but they couldn't take the future. As darkness fell, they walked back to Susan's car. A young girl rode past on a bicycle, reminding Emma of her own childhood rides through these same streets. I think I'm ready, Emma said, looking back at the town one last time. For what? Susan asked. To stop being split between Emma and Olivia. To just be me, whoever that is now. Susan nodded in understanding. And who is that? Emma smiled, the first truly peaceful smile in a long time. Someone who knows where she came from and where she's going. Someone who has 2 lives that are finally becoming one. As they drove away from Pine Creek, Emma felt something settle inside her. The story that began with the disappearance had come full circle. Not to an ending, but to a new beginning.